This is Chapter 2, Part 5, Rape of the Mind, by Juice Merleau, MD. Often those with a rigid, simple belief were better able to withstand the continual barrage against their minds than were the flexible, sophisticated ones, full of doubt and inner conflicts. The simple man with deep-rooted, freshly absorbed religious faith could exert a much greater inner resistance than could the complex, questioning intellectualist. The refined intellectual is much more handicapped by the internal pros and cons. In the totalitarian countries where belief in Pavlovian strategy has assumed grotesque proportions, the self-thinking, subjective man has disappeared. There is an utter rejection of any attempt at persuasion or discussion. Individual self-expression is taboo. Private affection is taboo. Peaceful exchange of thoughts and free conversation will disturb the conditioned reflexes and is therefore taboo. No longer are there any brains, only conditioned patterns and educated muscles. In such a taming system, neurotic compulsion is looked upon as a positive asset instead of something pathological. The mental automaton becomes the ideal of education. Yet the Soviet theoreticians themselves are often unaware of this, and many of them do not realize the dire consequences of subjecting man to a completely mechanistic conditioning. They themselves are often just as frightened as we are by the picture of the perfectly functioning human robot. This is what one of their psychologists says. The entire reactionary nature of this approach to man is completely clear. Man is an automaton who can be caused to act as one wills. This is the ideal of capitalism. Behold the dream of capitalism the world over, a working class without consciousness, which cannot think for itself, whose actions can be trained according to the whim of the exploiter. This is the reason why it is in America, the bulwark of present-day capitalism, that the theory of man as a robot has been so vigorously developed and so stubbornly held to. Bauer. Western psychology and psychiatry, although acknowledging its debt to Pavlov as a great pioneer who made important contributions to our understanding of behavior, takes a much less mechanical view of man than do the Soviet Pavlovians. It is apparent to us that their simple explanation of training ignores and rejects the concept of purposeful adaptation and the question of the goals to which this training is directed. Western experimental psychologists tend to see the conditioned reflex as developing fully only in the service of gratifying basic instinctual needs or of avoiding pain. That is only when the whole organism is concerned in the activity. In the complicated process of response to the world, conscious and especially unconscious drives and motivations play a role, as Freud taught us. All training, of which the conditioned response is only one example, is an automatization of actions which were originally consciously learned and thought over. The ideal of Western democratic psychology is to train men into independence and maturity by enlisting their conscious aid, awareness, and volition in the learning process. The ideal of the totalitarian psychology, on the other hand, is to tame men, to make them willing tools in the hands of their leaders. Like training, taming has the purpose of making actions automatic. Unlike training, it does not require the conscious participation of the learner. Both training and taming are energy and time-saving devices, and in both, the mystery of the psyche is hidden in the purposefulness of the responses. The automatization of functions in man saves him expenditure of energy, but can make him weaker when encountering new unexpected challenges. Cultural routinization and habit formation by local rules and myths make of everybody a partial automaton. National and racial prejudices are acted out unwittingly. Group hatred often bursts out almost automatically when triggered by slogans and catchwords. In a totalitarian world, this narrow disciplinarian conditioning is done more perfectly and more ad absurdum. The urge to be conditioned. One suggestion this chapter is not intended to convey is that Pavlovian conditioning as such is something wrong. This kind of conditioning occurs everywhere where people are together in common interaction. The speaker influences the listener, but the listener also the speaker. Through the process of conditioning, people often learn to like and to do what they are allowed to like and do. The more isolated the group, the stricter the conditioning that takes place in those belonging to the group. In some groups, one finds people more capable than others of conveying suggestion and bringing about conditioning. Gradually, one can discern the stronger ones, the better adjusted ones, the more experienced ones, and those noisier ones whose ability to condition others is strongest. Every group, every club, every society has its leading Pavlovian bell. This kind of person imprints his inner bell ringing on others. He can even develop a system of monolithic bell ringing. No other influential bell is allowed to compete with him. Another subtle question belongs to these problems. Why is there in us so great an urge to be conditioned, the urge to learn, to imitate, to conform, and to follow the pattern of family and group? This urge to be conditioned to submit to the communal pattern and the family pattern must be related to man's dependency on parents and fellow men. Animals are not so dependent on one another. In the whole animal kingdom, man is one of the most helpless, and naked beings. He remains like a monkey fetus. He never grows into the mature, hairy, fully covered state. In his persistent fetal state, he remains dependent on maternal care and paternal teaching and conditioning. But among the animals, man has relatively the longest youth and time for learning. At least this is what Louis Balk's fetalization theory tells us about man's retarded state and never-ending social dependency. Puzzlement and doubt, which inevitably arise in the training process, are the beginnings of mental freedom. Of course, the initial puzzlement and doubt is not enough. Behind that, there has to be faith in our democratic freedoms and the will to fight for it. I hope to come back to the central problem of faith and moral freedom as differentiated from conditioned loyalty and servitude in the last chapter. Puzzlement and doubt are, however, already crimes in the totalitarian state. The mind that is open for questions is open for dissent. In the totalitarian regime, the doubting, inquisitive, and imaginative mind has to be suppressed. The totalitarian slave is only allowed to memorize, to salivate when the bell rings. Ooh, sounds like our public education, doesn't it? It is not my task here to elaborate on the subject of the biased use of Pavlovian rules by totalitarians, but without doubt part of the interpretation of any psychology is determined by the ways we think about our fellow human beings and man's place in nature. If our ideal is to make conditioned zombies out of people, the current misuse of Pavlovianism will serve our purpose. But once we become even vaguely aware that in the totalitarian picture of man, the characteristic human note is missing. And when we see that in such a scheme, man sacrifices his instinctual desires, his pleasures, his aims, his goals, his creativity, his instinct for freedom, his paradoxicality, we immediately turn against this political perversion of science. Such use of Pavlovian technique is aimed only at developing the automaton in man, not his free, alert mind that is aware of moral goals and aims in life. Even in laboratory animals, we have found that effective goal-directedness can spoil the Pavlovian experiment. When, during a bell food training session, the dog's beloved master entered the room, the animal lost all its previous conditioning and began to bark excitedly. Here is a simple example of an age-old truth. Love and laughter can break through all rigid conditioning. The rigid automaton cannot exist without spontaneous self-expression. Apparently, the fact that the dog's spontaneous affection for his master could ruin all the mechanical calculations and manipulations never occurred to Pavlov's totalitarian students. And that, my friends, finishes chapter 2 of The Rape of the Mind by Juste Merleau.